Hello, everyone out there in the wide world. Tom, this is Nadim. I don't want to mispronounce your name, so
you can just say Nat.
All right, Nat. So, and we are going to talk, as a point of departure anyway, about Nat's recent book from Zero Books, Against Capitalist Education, a conversation. The book itself is. And why don't I just go ahead and ask you how? Well, I mean, I thought I might start by asking you this. Actually, if we're just sort of jumping in.
Yeah.
The point of departure for the formation of that book was another book, Capitalist Realism. It started, I guess, around 5 years ago. You note in the preface. And why don't you? Could you sort of very sort of quickly gloss capital realism and how that was a point of departure for you in terms of what then happens with your book, Against Capitalist Education?
In capitalist realism, the idea, I think Slavoj Žižek says the same thing, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And Mark Fischer, in that book, spun out for me the consequences of that, and the idea that there was an ontological or a psychological, almost a reality that was almost impossible to shift and shape. But he hinted at alternatives, challenging that. I mean, the basic thrust was, here it is. It looks like the end of the world would be easier, but perhaps, we, by stating it in such stark terms, perhaps there's a chance for an alternative. And so I emailed him after I read it, and I said to him, have you been working on an alternative? Do you like the work of Alain Badiou, the French philosopher? He seems to be doing stuff. And he said, no, he hadn't really started, or he had, but he couldn't really articulate a position, and he didn't like Alain Badiou. And so I thought I'd have a go. And so, so my response was, okay, or an alternative. But to frame it properly and fairly, I think it would be sensible to put it in context of a much longer sort of philosophical project I've been obsessed with for about 30 odd years. And that's an attempt to repeat that gesture of Descartes of founding a completely new method and creating a new era of thinking, a new type of approach to thinking. Not that I have any real personal affinity with Descartes' thinking, but I love the idea that let's reject every framework, every idea, anything I can sense, and let's see if we can put together a new framework. And I've been obsessed with that idea for about 30 years, and in the course of 30 years developed this symbolism, and it's become very mathematical, but it's not mathematical, it's more like art. And it's kind of brought me to this point where I think it may have something good and useful to contribute, but I'll be very, very cautious and humble about what it might offer.
Right. In fact, the discourse on method, if I recall correctly, Descartes sort of makes a similar gesture. He's like, well, look, I'm going to try this thing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's really working, but I believe it can be of some utility, so here it is. And he's sort of connecting it with what becomes the scientific, what is it becoming it as he's writing that work, and what becomes what we call as a scientific project. Now, what Descartes does is he connects his conception of that project to the idea of lordship and mastery over nature, which I think, and that's not merely a Cartesian sin. That's something which the Enlightenment itself, I think it's sort of broadly complicit in that. But so said, if you can extricate the Cartesian point of departure from necessarily instrumentalist tact with respect to nature. all that said, what you're saying is that you are taking up the idea of using something like radical, like hyperbolic doubt, real sort of jettisoning of prior presuppositions to look at things afresh. And there are other kind of analogs in the history of thought, like Husserl's epoche or epoch, where you sort of bracket yourself from the presuppositions. That's the question that I'm inclined to put to you, is how do you deal with the challenge of finding out what are the latent presuppositions that you are carrying into the process? And then how do you free yourself from the possible compromise which those latent presuppositions can bring to bear upon you?
That's a really. I'm not looking at the screen because I'm scribbling notes so I can follow the line of question. I hope that's all right.
Yes, it's quite fine. Yeah. It's quite fine.
Two things. I suppose on one level, I don't believe you can remove all the presuppositions for a kind of very crude reason that we are situated, we're in the world, and by being in the world, to what extent can we free ourselves from the presuppositions of the social and political frameworks in which we live and all the rest of it? So I think there's a big question about whether I would even, just to eat, for example, just to have my burger and chips, what kind of presuppositions? For me, to carry this thing forward, I find that area, I'm not sure I can be free, but I can bring clarity to it. But when you talk about Descartes and Hume, and I think of Locke, and I think of that whole classical modern thread, I think they were all wedded to a really simple presupposition, which was the first intuition that set me on my road, I suppose. It struck me as so obvious, and I thought what I've got to do is try to really clarify what this assumption was. I see it in Kant. I see it in, obviously Hume. Descartes classically formulated his mind-body. Locke formulated the primary-secondary distinction, and that, I think, carries this same presupposition that the mind-body does. I know I'm... the only people I'm not so sure who did in that era are Spinoza. I'm not sure whether he bought into the same assumptions, and Leibniz, because I'm not quite sure what Leibniz's thinking does. It seems a bit odd.
Spinoza... Yeah, because Spinoza, interestingly, and I don't know much about Spinoza, but where he might sort of step outside of the problematic of the subject-object split, is that he has the notion of the physical and the mental as being expressive of a common underlying substance.
Yeah, I think
so. In fact, usually you go dualism, monism, but he actually adds the notion of a third term. So in that respect, conceptually, he doesn't fit neatly. As far as Leibniz goes, that's I don't know. That's interesting, but that's almost tangential. I'm sorry.
No.
There's so many interesting tangents in this kind of thing that it's hard to stay the course, right? But to go on, so let me ask you this: if I'm hearing you correctly,
okay.
What you identify as broadly the presupposition of the Enlightenment project is a presupposition of the mind-body split, the classical dualism of Descartes. Is that accurate? Am I hearing you correctly?
Partly.
And so
I think the mind-body split is derivative. It's a secondary distinction. I think there's a more primitive one. And I think you see it more in the British empiricists. I think the problem, I'm not saying they resolved it, but the real problem seems to really start with Locke, if I could name a particular figure. And Locke, the distinction of primary and secondary properties, which I think just opened up, his hidden assumption, which none of them really seem to reconcile.
Can you describe that as explicate that distinction? I have to confess, my Locke's a bit minimal. So
it's more like so how would I characterize it? With Locke, the way I see Locke was that there is I'm using my own language, I suppose, to try to do it. There is a context.
That's fine.
There is how would I put it? A junction. It's an odd term, like a junction between cars, shall we say? Like where you have traffic lights. It's almost like that concept I would use, but I would perhaps prefer to use the concept of a context boundary. And I think of it, if I were to give a metaphor, it would be light passing through water, and the way that it, there's a boundary it passes through, and it deflects or refracts or it affects the light coming through the other side. And what I detect in Locke, as the first person who articulated this, was that there is this boundary, this junction between a subject and an object, and information which passes, sensory information which passes across to the subject, passes across some kind of context boundary, which is this indefinable line between the end of the subject and the beginning of where the object lives. And then he goes on to say that actually there's certain properties of the object which don't get refracted, inflected through this context boundary, i.e. they're not influenced or affected by distortions in your perceptual system. They remain constant or invariant across the two. It's a very kind of pseudo-scientific, you can see him worshipping at the feet of the new science and wishing that he could get these invariants right, these things that would not change, and then you can build your mathematical systems on. So it's weird. They split the world, which we all know, between the subjects and the object, but they posit, in order to split the world, a primary concept, which I call a junction, like an interaction junction or a context boundary of some kind. And a
node of some sort.
Yeah. And so, you get the classic, here's a very classic philosophical, quite dead end.
Interface.
Like an interface, yeah. But the interesting thing about an interface is that concept then starts infecting so many other thinkers. So if you roll forward a little bit, you get Hume, who says that we get these impressions on this side of the interface. We receive something, we form impressions, and then we can construct within our mental machinery, etc., etc. But a version of that thinking happens in Kant as well. And Kant sort of takes it to the nth degree by positing at this context boundary a completely unknowable object on the other side. So there is your junction, of which there is movement, some kind of flow from the object to the subject, which none of them seem to want to deny. But at the same time, there's a problem about what the real nature of that object is. So you can say
it's a black box of kind.
It's
really.
Yeah. So let's take the black. Yeah, the black box is a very, very good way of putting it. But the problem with the black box concept is that you receive information from that object. It's not. You're not. The problem with those thinkers is that they surround the subject in a kind of boundary, and they say that the sense system, your perceptual system, your sensory data pours in and is somehow distorted, refracted, past the boundary. You cannot know the world as it is because you're always receiving this sensory influx and you're always operating on it. That's Kant's take on the whole, his resolution for it. But then if you roll forward, I find personally, thinkers like Jacques Lacan is infected by that same kind of thought, that context boundary is now posited as a mirror. So as the subject and the baby turns into a subject, emerges into the world, it no longer can say, what's going on the, it doesn't know what the mother's really thinking, but there's a mirror, a boundary, which is reflecting back and it's constituting itself as a subject. And I would also say Rousseau, also in his amour propre and his amour de soi, I'm really mispronouncing those really badly, but the idea that, again, when you're up against another person, you're up against really essentially a boundary of some kind, and that boundary is the one assumption that psychology is inherited, lots and lots of I don't know, psychology, mainstream psychology has. Here's a classic one, which I think, which we probably both know, is the problem of other minds, which A.J. Ayer and other British early 20th century thinkers taxed themselves enormously about. How can you know what another person is thinking? And you think to yourself, well, in your everyday life, this is where Wittgenstein comes in and wants to smash the whole thing down. But you see in their thinking this idea that there is this hidden assumption, there's this assumption operating that there is a junction, and you cannot somehow receive a message from another person without it being distorted or refracted. So you cannot really know what another person is thinking, or how can you be sure? And this leads, I think, reinforces hyper-individualism, atomism of the individual, this kind of decline of the notion of a social body as somehow it can share and stuff like this. So I'll stop there because it's kind of a lot.
Well, there's a good deal of stuff that you said there, and I'm just thinking, what's implicit in the arc of your remarks there, I think, is that this presupposition of the hard split, and that's even itself sort of, I believe you're positing a derivative of a more sort of primordial or primary problematic, needs to be challenged. We need to sort of re-examine how, for instance, something like identity occurs or arises, right? And if I'm thinking that where you're going, and I don't want to, I think where you're going is to suggest that you want to decenter the notion of something like identity from a fixed point, which would be sort of like one of the sides of this juncture that you're talking about. Or you could say that perhaps let us dissolve the notion of the juncture or the boundary, or if we're going to retain it, sort of lend to it a more porous quality, and hence your use of the metaphor of the water, or the use of the language of a context boundary, which is more porous isn't quite the right word, but it's less fixed.
Yes, yeah.
Sort of like a probability field, right? It's not rigid.
No.
And this sort of greater, sort of more fluid way of conceiving what we're encountering in the world, right? Could perhaps give us a new flexibility, a new, it can expand the horizons of that we could potentially explore. Because right now it's as if we're stuck on a railway track, right? We can go back and forth, or even if we're on like a railway network, we're still bounded by the rails. And it could be that to really move beyond our present impasse, we have to actually step off the rails. And in order to step off the rails, we have to look at why we're on them in the first place. And you're locating at least an important part of why we're on the rails in a conception of, I don't know if you want to say a conception of self, because I see that you really want to get really far down, right to the nitty gritty, and even self is almost like a second or third or fourth order notion, right? It's actually, so by the time you're talking about self, you've already imported, sometimes just implicitly, a whole array of suppositions. And so you have to get beyond that. But what's really, I think, tricky about getting beyond the concept of the self, and maybe this is like deeper than even like the Enlightenment or even perhaps Western thought, is that then you just enter into this weird space where if like we just radically decenter, if we have absolutely nothing on which to hold,
Okay.
Where are we? Who are we? Right? And it's frankly mildly terrifying, to consider, that there is no positive identity, even if it's provisional, that's better than nothing. But if you like really push it, it's like it's not even provisional. It's like the notion of a fixed self is entirely fictitious.
Yeah.
And but it's just there's like a phenomenal weirdness to try and to navigate the world without that kind of fixity, right? Is that sort of like where you're going with this?
I like the way that you're characterizing it, because you make me think of Emerson, who I'm a huge fan of, and Thoreau as well, I suppose. And Emerson, I think, says things very similar to how you've just articulated it. That the further you go into, if I were to attempt to try to put an anchor somewhere so we could have some point which would help orientate us if we abandon this context boundary as an absolute, we try to look at really sensibly about how the self is constructed, what the nature of it is, and all this kind of stuff, and said to ourselves, what does it leave us with? I would say that the tradition then that I like to go to, and I was thinking about this, and I'm wondering if you also have stumbled into this tradition, that if you look at German idealism, it leaps across via some figures in the UK, Coleridge of all people, across to America at the turn of the last century and earlier, with figures like Thoreau, Emerson, and the so-called American Transcendentalist movement. Have you ever come across them?
Well, yes. Actually, I was flirted with American Transcendentalism, but it was a few years ago.
Right.
Emerson and Thoreau are the two of them with whom I'm most acquainted. The other end of that, Whitman is, I think, considered like the last American Transcendentalist. I think you're about to bring up Swedenborg, though, because I think he was very influential in American Transcendentalists. Well, I don't believe he himself was an American Transcendentalist. Right? Is he German?
Yeah.
I confess my ignorance.
He's Swedish.
But he had a great effect on them.
But it's
it is. Go on.
It is, yeah. But there's an irony, because Kant wrote a very damning article about Swedenborg, which basically marginalized Swedenborg from mainstream philosophy. He basically said, dreams of a spirit seer, very famous condemnation of Swedenborg. And then Swedenborg disappears off the mainstream. He becomes a kind of a marginal, a kind of esoteric thinker, someone who you want to, and then suddenly the German idealists, the post-Kantian thinkers, Schelling in particular, and Hegel to some extent, stumble into Jacob Boehm, and they stumble into a tradition which attempts to articulate a territory outside of the boundary of, if you like, the things that you were just saying. If we were to say crudely from Descartes up to Kant and the thinkers that fit around that, plus the scientific revolution that occurred at the same time, and that coupling with that type of work, he's on the margins of that and those types of thinkers. So I do want to say him, but I want to introduce him, not everything about him, because I don't come from a very religious background myself. And it's not necessarily his discussions with devils and conversations with angels, which he wrote about, which are really actually fascinating anyway. But it's a couple of ideas that he had, which I think rescue this question of what happens to the subject once you put under, bring under issue this whole 18th century junction, this thinking between the mind and the body, between the self and the other, the self and the object, the subject and the object. How can you know it? What kind of frameworks you operate? You could go the mathematical path, but I don't think mathematics does the work. Swedenborg had, I think, one really startling idea, which I think the father of William James, Henry James Sr., wrote about. And I think it's the one idea which I think, if you unpack it, it opens up a possibility that's native to Western thought. It isn't alien. It doesn't belong to the Orient. But it has some very, very interesting consequences. And that is simply the idea of the influx. Have you come across this idea of the influx, it's called?
No, not specifically. I know that you allude to it in some of your YouTube stuff, but go ahead and unpack that.
Okay, so he basically says, crudely put, if you take the Heraclitan model of the universe, that all is flux. But with Heraclitus, you get the feeling that it's a kind of chaos, it's out of control, it's directionless, that's not necessarily true to Heraclitus, I have to say. But what Swedenborg does is he puts, like a lot of Neoplatonic and kind of mystical thinkers, a kind of point into the map, into this virtual, imaginal or imaginary realm, and says, okay, let's just posit that for a moment and say that the universe that we experience as solid and permanent, like the Buddhists, is actually a flow out of this point into the world, which constitutes the phenomenal world. And just as the Buddhists say, it returns to it in some kind of way. So crudely put, there's a lot of other religious traditions which seem to say similar things. But what makes Swedenborg interesting for me is he says the nature of consciousness and the subject is entirely constituted by this influx from a point within the structure of consciousness itself, which is a slightly odd thing to say. I can draw it.
Isn't that sort of almost set consciousness up as exhibiting a kind of autonomy?
No, it can do if you take the body and you take the individual human being as an entity existing in their own right. What I think he's trying to get at is that root, I think Emerson had a kind of, his version of it was, he called it the world soul, which sounds really kind of Jungian and, oh no, we're getting all new agey. And I think that's the danger with this type of stuff. It starts sounding a little bit woolly and, and all very nice and all the rest of it. But I actually don't think it is that woolly. I think that we need to do a little bit of hard work around this to tease out what it's saying. If there is such a thing that the structure of existence isn't simply flat, it isn't just a structure of atoms built out of other subatomic particles. They all jiggle about, they're all subject to laws, but the universe is flat. You can almost draw a band, and theoretical physics is about to get to the bottom level of what are they called? Strings. And these composite multidimensional strings, and the world is built out of it, and then everything else emerges out of combinations and permutations of these fundamental structures. But essentially, it's flat. It's like a plane. What these thinkers are saying is that the idea that the whole universe isn't built out of bits and pieces, whether it's string theory, subatomic particles, sub structures, laws, regulate. It goes downwards in a way that it emerges much like a plant, much like an organic growth of something from a point deep within a soil, and that soil remains an unknown background to some extent. So what they're saying, and what I'm trying to get at, is that the point at which you, as a subject, arrive at the point where your root is, it's very close to the root of where the whole universe and cosmos is. That's essentially what he's saying. At that point, the classical distinctions between I'm a separate entity, you're a separate entity, it's not that we all merge into some lovely soup and all have a great psychedelic mystical experience, which isn't amorphous. It's very, very carefully structured. What it's essentially saying is that at the root, there is a relationship between everything. And the deeper you go, the closer you come to this sense that how is it that if the universe emerges from a single point, crudely put, and everything is related, how can we experience life at the level we do with all of these endless divisions and splits, including the subject-object, mind, body, splits that are taken for granted within all of our traditional and mainstream ways of thinking. And I like that way of thinking, but what I don't like is all the woolly associations. I don't necessarily like all the New Age associations with that type of thinking, that, you know, you can read a bunch of poetry and you'll be okay. I don't think it reduces to that.
It actually kind of misses the point.
Yeah.
Because the real point of getting into that stuff is to actually get into that stuff.
Yeah.
And now it's actually very in your face. It's not escapist in the least. Which Zen people, I think, are really good on this point, where they have their koanic tradition, and they have like expressions like enlightenment is chopping wood and carrying water and washing your bowl. It's like, it's right here, man. Yeah. It's right bloody here. But to really, or the, you know, within the Christian line, taking the idea that the kingdom of God is not like on the other side of the eschaton.
Right.
It's right here. Or this is the eschaton. Yeah. This is it right here, right? You know, this is where the rubber's hitting the road. And you get all woolly about it, but then what you've actually formulated is an escapism, or you're lost in something like Chogyam Trungpa calls it spiritual materialism, right? And you've missed the boat. He's like, no, that's not what we're talking about.
No, absolutely.
We're really talking about actually what's right in front of us.
Yeah.
You know, and that the cosmos, you know, which of the enormous and see, they say, well, we are the cosmos. And then you say that, and then it sounds incredibly woolly. It sounds like, oh my God.
Yeah.
You know, oh.
Yeah.
Where's your patchouli and tie-dye shirt, man? You know. Okay. It's like, you know, and there's nothing wrong, by the way, with patchouli and tie-dye shirt. But, you know, hey, okay, so what's perhaps useful about this moment is that we can reconnect now with the question of education, right? So what is the function of education? You know, and there's a temptation, you know, you've got this sort of crass idea of education as serving vocational ends, right? It's subjected to technological imperatives. Sometimes it comes across not so crudely, right? There's still lip service given to the idea of, you know, having a liberal arts education or humanities and so forth. But it's still very hard to extricate from a certain instrumentalism.
Yeah.
And we have someone, I'm not familiar, Carlton. I think he has perhaps a question for it. Should we let him in here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey guys.
Hey.
I'm sorry I'm not wearing it. I have my tie-dye T-shirt in the closet though. Not a question so much, Thomas, as though I found it an interesting conversation so far. So I thought if you don't mind, I'd sit in and maybe every now and then. Yeah. Okay.
So, thank you. Thanks for joining. Did you have any thoughts to insert at the moment? As you're jumping on.
You know, only in I mean, I don't want to go back and rehash sort of the notion of free will or identity and consciousness. You guys, it sounded like, I mean, we haven't been here that long, but it sounds like you just got done sort of wrapping that up. So, I definitely think though, when you talk about education, you're right. I think historically, it had a vocational end to it. But I think, at least from my perspective, I think that's just sort of a byproduct on the sideline. I tend to look at education as a way to better prepare people, or not better prepare is not the right word, to create people who are better suited to helping us create a better society. In other words, they're better suited to participate in a variety of things, whether we're talking about civil law legislation, whether we're talking about morals and ethics, whether we're talking about how to get to a certain point. I know it sounds very vague to sort of say it makes a better citizen, but I think ultimately that's the point of education. I think there's a byproduct, sure, may help you get a better job, although that's dwindling by pretty quickly. My son just got home from college, right? So he's home looking for a job, and can't find one. And he's got his degrees in physics and math, and he still can't find one. So,
All right. Well, I'll tell you what. I have some thoughts there, but let me ask Nat here. Now, how do you respond there to that characterization? Or if you want, you can also just sort of more positively state what your position is on education.
I agree with that last comment. The idea that in the book I use the phrase economic fundamentalism, and I agree it's failed. I mean, graduates are coming out supposedly equipped to be able to enter the economic and the working world, to be able to slot themselves into some kind of way. But we know we're churning out so many graduates, so many people with a range of skills, and they're not able to do it. And the model is flawed because what it doesn't, I would take a step back, and I wouldn't comment on it because I did physics and at university the first time round as well. And it was my point of departure, I suppose, to realize that my love of science was really the fact that science was seen as incredibly useful, was seen as something that if I were to enter science and contribute towards science, I would justify my whole existence. I was very, very idealistic. Whether I went into a job, the finance sector and worked with maths or something wasn't in my thinking. But what I've come to believe after 30 years of thinking about this is that in the meantime, that there is something about what it means to be a human being that we are sidelining quite profoundly. And we are also, I think, we're wedded too heavily to the idea that our educational institutions must output someone who can get themselves a job. Whereas for me, I would love it. In the book, I play on the idea of making up a university in which the education creates a freedom and a space in which people imagine alternative ways that you could exist. Not just as kind of not a hippie commune, or not just kind of repeating the gestures of the past, but just the principle that if we can produce calculus and we can produce put men on the moon, then why can't we produce people who are capable through an education system to think of alternative social and political organizations? So what it means to be a human being without destroying the planet, coexisting in some kind of way that doesn't always lead to conflict, that doesn't wed us to all the things that we witness in the news on a daily basis, that these things that we take are for intractable realities, they just don't necessarily have to be the case. But it's a big ask. What kind of education would it be? And often the people who engage in the broader type of conversation are people who, after college or after their formal education, get interested and start asking broader questions, get involved in movements of alternative politics or movements of this. But my feeling is the mainstream from kindergarten or nursery, as we call it in the UK, all the way through should be generating and developing the imagination as something which
I think there's a guy named Ken Robinson who does an excellent TED video talk on this. In that, that educational systems are sort of stuck in the 19th century.
Right.
It is very much about, and I think that we still perceive it this way, it's very much about the takeaway in terms of what you learn, the things, the data, the facts.
Yeah.
And I think that misses the mark entirely. I think that may have been useful in the 19th century. Maybe that was important in the 19th century. I think the generations, where we're going into now, it is far more important that somebody learn how to ask the right questions, that someone learns how to critically analyze their thoughts and their ideas, that someone learns how to explore, beyond just the inspiration to do so. I think there is a skill set there that we have misequated with learning facts. So we get somebody out of university and they are very smart in a particular area or in a particular domain, but they literally still many of them don't know how to think properly. They don't. I've been a software developer my whole life. One guy impressed me in a bad way, and it stuck with me, who had just gotten out of university, right? And had just, passed all the Microsoft exams, right? And at some point, we asked him to actually do something which was not, right, a question on the Microsoft exam. And he was dumbfounded. And it wasn't that he didn't know the answer to a particular problem. It was he had no clue how to go about finding the answer to the problem, and seemed to lack the desire to do so, to put the work in. I think that's what we're missing in education. I mean, I was sorry for a soapbox a little bit, but I think that there is a very unique piece there in the educational process that we have missed in the past, and maybe it wasn't so noticeable in the past because we were more focused on, can we please produce a generation of people that can read and write and do arithmetic? But now, we've gotten there, but now we don't have a new goal to drive us. We don't know where we're going. We're sort of floundering now.
Well, we have Theodore here joining us. Hello. Theodore.
Can you hear me?
I do know. Yes. I just could. I was turning you in just one moment. I was going to say, I think it's not an accident that there is a discouragement of undue creativity within our contemporary educational framework. In fact, the formation of that framework, in my understanding of the 19th century, was pretty explicitly committed to creating a docile population that would be amenable to factory work and to, service in certain military capacities. A lot of it, I think, actually came out of Prussia. Right, so there was actually an alarming degree of conscientious suppression of certain human dispositions within the formation of the present framework. So it's not just an accident. We can talk about that more. I just wanted to sort of append that to your remarks, Carlton. But Theodore just joined us. What would you like to bring to the table, sir? Any questions, or did you have a comment, or are you
I'm
jumping in?
But one of the one thing I'd like to bring to the conversation is this idea that when we talk about education, we have to preface it with the notion that the first education a baby receives is through the parenting. And this brings about an interesting paradigm, because kids are front-loaded with a language, with models, with frameworks that they then bring to the education system. So it's very hard to change things, if not impossible to change things, unless we're talking about generational changes, okay? And usually in generational changes, what we're talking about is the environment also changes. But things like language, belief structures, and to a large degree diet, body type, all of that comes from the foundation that's created in early childhood development. Now, and just if I could give you an example of that, in neuroscience, we know that bilingualism sets up a certain potentiation, which has effects later in life. Fewer people that are bilingual are affected with diseases like Alzheimer's. And so why do we wait to teach bilingualism to students when they're in high school? Why aren't we understanding that there's a window of opportunity where children are developing language for their first time, and that they have the potential to set up these two different systems of language, which has a potentiation. It sets up a framework, sort of this statistical framework in the brain that gets them to understand different concepts aside from the language.
I think that's an excellent example. And then I think also your redirection of focus to early childhood and the relationship with parents, or the early familiar unit, might be something quite deserving of exploration. So let me turn to Nat and ask him what his thoughts are, because he just has this recent book out, and he's against capitalist education. I should put the link up if I can. But Nat, what are your thoughts there in response to that, and also what Carl did?
It is a very interesting point about. I've grown up in a bilingual household, although technically I can't speak my mother's tongue anymore. I'm so awful at it. But there is a lot of there's an interesting insight in the notion of having two languages. I would say this, that if I were to just put out a thought experiment for a second, humanity throws out occasionally what we call geniuses, people who we assume are in the minority and are subject to very unique cognitive and neurological and whatever makeup of some kind, in some kind of thing. So you think of what it takes. If I were to define a genius as someone who genuinely formulates something new, an idea, new conception, a new approach to something, but it's not a meaningless creation. It's not just a piece of novelty. So if I think of Picasso, Mozart, Goethe, just off the top of my head as three simple examples, what if we make there are certain assumptions we make which we've inherited from 200 or 300 years and of accrued thinking built around certain assumptions about the nature of the human being, that although neuroscience has some fantastic openings and shows some fantastic possibilities of the nature of the brain, it doesn't really get to this particular question of what the nature of a particular mind is, or what a particular consciousness is. Although that might sound like a contentious point to make, because if you're wedded to Daniel Dennett, you're wedded to the idea that the mind is output from the brain and brain basically determines it, it's impossible to follow my particular point of view. But what happens if consciousness isn't a product of material processes, but requires material conditions in order to emerge? So it's not just physical, because we're cultural creatures, and the ideas and the cultural worlds in which we live and which we're born. So the classic example of a child coming into the world, you get Jacques Lacan talking about the mirror. You see Rousseau talking about how a child realizes that when they cry, there's a difference between a genuine cry, I need something, and a cry of manipulation because they realize they can manipulate a parent. These types of concepts, which philosophers and psychoanalysts have produced, suggest to us that our consciousness is far, far deeper and richer than even our most exciting boundaries of neuroscience have let us come to. So therefore, my contention is that if our education system becomes less dysfunctional, less output oriented, less oriented towards just simply putting us into a predetermined world, but actually makes it, as people have said before, more creative, I think personally it's a big question, and it's very difficult to answer because I have no evidence to prove it, but it's just an intuition of mine that it could profoundly change the way that we understand what we are as human beings. If I can just put a footnote to it, the anti-psychiatry movement, especially of the R.D. Laing variety, he had a notion, and he says it, that Freud, for all of Freud's problems and issues with Freud, he showed us just how fragmented and desiccated a human being is in their everyday life. Not that we're loveless, that our lives are meaningless, but that fully understand what it means to be human, we need to see the pinnacles of humanity to remind us of what it is. And it doesn't just belong to a handful of geniuses. It's kind of a little bit of a ramble. I do apologize.
That's all right. I mean, well, what do you guys think, Carlton, and then Theodore?
If you don't mind. If you don't mind, let Theodore go first, please.
All right.
Well, my response to that was going to be that I've raised this issue several times. I said that this is the first time in human history that we're actually able to understand what the potential of a human being might be, or at least to ponder that notion. You know, what is optimum conditioning, in other words? So we've never really considered that before. We were to take our thought about that might be if you had an individual child, that child had potential and it grew on its own. And what we're now learning is that the environment plays a significant role in that. And so what we could say is if we understand that the environment plays a significant role in this, well, what would the optimum environment be? And let me go back to language for a moment, because if we understand that there are windows of opportunity for things like language, obviously if you took a baby from China and put it in an English-speaking country, at the proper time when that window of opportunity is open for that baby to learn language, the baby absorbs language in a way that does not differentiate, doesn't acquire an accent. Okay, there are 100 sounds that incorporate all the human languages, and you can take any baby and expose them at that proper stage, and they acquire language without an accent. After that window closes, you acquire language in a different way. And if you learn that language, it's very difficult not to learn the language and speak it with an accent. Okay? I think we can all agree on that. So somebody said to me, gee, we should learn to meditate. And I said, well, gee, that's an interesting point. If I learn to meditate at my age, am I learning to meditate it with an accent? So that there are these carryovers that there seems to be windows of opportunity where we need to build the foundation for these things, much like with language, that we need to build a foundation and then build on that, because that's going to be the way these things are able to organize. But if we don't have that foundation, then what happens is we can still build this, but it's built in a very different way.
So, I knew you want to say something.
Yeah, I just want to respond to that. I think that we're getting two levels of things confused, and I entirely agree with what you're saying about the acquisition and development of language, but I don't accept for a second that you need a foundation for this. I think that that idea, is built on an assumption that somehow, to do more complex things, you need to have done something, you need to have acquired, I don't know how to put it, but I don't believe this is an issue of foundations. You can do philosophy, you can engage with your humanity independently of your level of sophistication and conceptual skills, shall we put it, your cognitive skills. To be fully a human being, Aristotle said what kind of society would make the human being flourish. I don't think that this is a question of layers. There is no evidence to suggest, and actually I would argue the evidence goes the other way, that there are in each era of humanity people, and lots of people, who don't seem completely bounded by the frameworks in which they're born. And I think anyone who can engage in philosophy and question, to some extent, you would have to see is questioning the frameworks and ideas within the world in which they live. Then we're not obliged to have to take them on, and we need them in order to go forward. I think there's no foundation here.
Well, are you saying... sorry, Thomas, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say that there might be an intermediary position here between what Theodore's suggesting and that, right? In that, and then Carl, I know you had that question about supervenience. And we'll
no. I wasn't. I have another one for that, if you don't mind.
But the thing is that obviously, like you say, you agree, development, especially early childhood development, can be enormously advantageous, right?
Yeah.
But I think that maybe your concern that is that if we focus unduly on the question of early childhood development, we might accidentally lose sight. And I'm not saying this was actually what was said, but people can infer incorrectly of the capacity that inherits in us, even presently, whether you're 18 or 38 or 79. There's a capacity which it inheres in human being as a way of being to sort of learn and grow and move in different ways.
Yeah.
So we should not, in virtue of our appreciation of the virtues of early, childhood development as places where we can put energy and resource, lose sight of the capacity we have as adults or wherever. Right? Is that your concern?
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't want to deny the value and the significance of what Theodore has said. I agree that there's clearly a massive amount of impact on a child to the brain. No doubt.
All right.
But I think it is a fundamental error if we focus on just that particular time slice. Because as an adult, as a 70-year-old, you might be thinking Zen with an accent. It's a really good metaphor. But why is that any less authentic Zen than a Japanese person where Zen was in fact partly borrowed from Buddhism, which was an invention on another? It depends what you mean by, whether humanity is common to us and by you entering something like that.
So, I'm sorry. I hate to be dictatorial as the moderator, but we're running up against time. Yeah. So, Theodore, I imagine you have a response to that, and then Carlton, you had a question.
Okay, well,
and there are some interesting questions on the margin too. But Theodore, go ahead.
Well,
and then Carlton, to you.
Just very quickly, what I was saying about things being developmental and having a foundation was within the context of this idea of what would optimization be. Again, I think we've reached a point in humanity where we've never considered what the human potential actually is. That we sort of had a notion in the past that people just were born with potential inside of them, much like an acorn, and that they grew up into a certain type of person. And that I think we understand now that that's not true. That there is conditioning that goes on. And there's potential in individuals that need to be nurtured. One other thing I would bring up is a great book, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And he talks about these things like cognitive biases and different types of thinking that go on that we really need to observe in ourselves in order not to work against ourselves. And so that's the other part of it I would bring up is that how much of what it is that we do learn are sort of illusory, and we need to spend a lot of time undoing. It's sort of like with the definition of insanity is doing the same things over and over again and expecting different results. So we seem to do that. We seem to set ourselves up where we are given towards a certain predisposition about doing things over and over again, and we expect different results. And we don't have the tools to figure out what it is that we need to do differently.
That's interesting.
Yes. So, let me ask Carlton, because there's lots of open doors there. But
no kidding. Which one do I flip a coin here?
So
I think there was a book out. The book has been out for it's an older book, but it was called Skeptics and True Believers by a guy named Chet Ramo. And he put forth the notion that people who end up being skeptics or atheists, and I don't think it wasn't necessarily in regards to religion, but his underlying kind of thesis in the book was that there is an underlying mindset that drives people into a particular direction. And people who have this underlying mindset tend to become either skeptics or theists. In other words, there's this differentiation between faith and how you come to knowledge and belief that seems to be part of a deeper process. And I think, and I don't have a background in this, so I'm kind of talking out my whatever, but it seems to me from what Theodore said that, that the minds in children are more fluid than they are in adulthood, that there is a flexibility that's inherent in that growth process, and that it is probably to some extent a unique opportunity that we have to mold the underlying landscape that they're going to build their life on. It's not that you can't learn a language when you're older. I ended up learning Spanish when I married my wife, who doesn't speak English, right? It came way later. And I did it all right. But I do think that there's a point there that if we can understand and mold the landscape and terraform, if you will, the human brain as it's growing, but through education, then we can direct society in much, what's the word I'm looking for here? Almost like, I can't think of the word, but almost like you see those nature channels where you have schools of fish where all the fish move at the same time, right, through the ocean. Almost like that. Systems. Yes. So if we can terraform the brain and control how it forms, then and we might be able to direct society, the way we. I don't know that that's true or not, but it seems it's a possibility anyway.
And I
have. Well, let me tell you what. I guess we're running up on time. I'm sorry. Let me just hand it over to you, Nat. We've got about maybe 5 or so minutes before at least I have to go. I'm sorry.
Okay. No. But absolutely. It's fascinating, and it's interesting how Theodore and Carlton are talking about the early childhood, and it's interesting the language being used of optimization, optimal conditioning, without wishing to contend any of it. And let's just assume that it's all right, it's all correct, that the science supports all of that. My biggest issue here is that we won't get the social change we want if we focus on that. If you read Brave New World, for example, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, that's an imagined version of what you have just described. And you look at a society which cannot be happy and never quite realize what it means to be human. And the paradox of what it means for a group of adults to say, let's mold the underlying landscape for a particular group of children, another generation, for all the right reasons. I'm not denying the intentions here, but Brave New World, I think, expresses the issue here. Freedom as an adult isn't something that needs to have a massive amount of brain structuring. There seems to be something flawed in our model of what it means to be human if we can't as adults engage within this. If you see what I mean, if the argument is that we are so shut down as adults that we can't do anything, therefore we've got to look at our children, we've got to look at optimizing and all this kind of stuff with it, I think it expresses a symptom of our age and where the problem is. Because I fundamentally think philosophy, genuine philosophy, there's a line early in Plato, when Plato comes down from a festival, Socrates does, and he meets an old friend of his, Cephalus, who says to him, oh, now that I'm older, I now have the freedom to engage in philosophy. Because now I'm rid of all the bodily issues and all my preoccupations, I now have the freedom and the space. And in many ways, I think we run a danger that we assume neuroscience is our savior, because I think just engaging within these questions as adults, whether we get them in the right accent, whether we know what the real case is, whether we understand them fully, is actually much, much more profound and important to us, because it will make us as adults more sensitive and alert to the dangers of conditioning, to the dangers of totalitarianism, which optimization and language like that ultimately can easily lead for the best reasons possible. And so my argument is, leaving aside childhood and clearly the benefit, because I can't add to it. We need to either do it or not. And and I don't think I want to. I have young children, and my strongest instinct is that it takes a maturing process. As children get older and you engage them with the world and you critically engage them with the world in which they live, that they can see things because in the process of using their imagination and showing them alternatives, you show them, you cast a light on the world they see. And whether, they'll become philosophers in their own right is another issue, but it's more of a disposition to the world that you really want to think and engage it and have the freedom to look at the kind of social formations we have, if you see what I mean. So
if I can comment just real quick, I just want to say though, it sounds like in that description, it sounds like with your children that you are actually doing the very thing that you're arguing against. You are molding the way their brains are forming at a young age, so that as they mature, they will be more inclined to look at the world skeptically and to look at it from a philosophical standpoint. That's what it sounds like.
It could be. I won't deny that. But what I would say is that no one did that to me. And I find myself as an adult approaching my 50s very, very closely, more and more thinking more now where my brain's, using kind of neuroscience, the brain is so plastic, it doesn't determine this outcome at all. I think now that I'm almost 50, if you look at the history of philosophy, you find the majority of philosophers, great philosophers, have pictures of them as old men. And the reason that they have pictures of them as old men is because it sometimes takes a lifetime of thinking about stuff in order to really understand it, a lifetime of engaging with it, that the child, it's an important part of the picture. But adulthood is something and maturing of our minds through engagement in philosophy is something I think it's a danger to forget.
If I could jump in, I don't disagree with what you're saying, and certainly I've focused on the early childhood development. I think there's a few other things to add for me to support what it is that you're saying, and I'm only suggesting that there's a different paradigm. If we looked at life as being a self-organizing network, okay, then what we're saying is that I'm not saying we should mold children. I think that is what we do now. I'll agree with Carlton. I think we do that, and we don't think we do that. And the alternative to that is to nudge the system. That the children are, or the brain is a self-organizing network. So instead of saying to a child, this is something, and then the child repeats that's what this is, we say to the child, what do you think? When the child asks, what is this? You say, well, what do you think it is? And thereby allowing the child to see many possibilities instead of limiting the child to just the one possibility of what it is. Sure. The other thing is, there's, I can't recall who it is right now, but I pumped into the comments there that there's this idea of teachable moments. And the guy that created that concept says that learning and development goes on throughout our lifetimes. So, but unfortunately, we don't accept that. We think we go to school and then that's it, and we become adults. And these all form default systems that really don't have a lot of validity. And you're absolutely right that when you get older, you've acquired so much information that you then start to put these pieces of information in ways that create knowledge and wisdom. And that's a very important mindset. And I think, the reason we're all having this conversation is because we've overcome some of that. And we're the few and not the many. We're talking about how can the many benefit from some of this.
But I think, and I'll probably have to get going after this, but I think that maybe part of the concern, and again, it's really that there's both and not either or. But I think part of the concern is the focus that the dominant discourse sometimes places on neuroscience as a place from which to draw advice is that it as a way of speaking potentially undercuts a commitment to human agency and freedom. Start thinking of ourselves as just complex physical systems then it's almost like we lose track of our ability to like actually engage and actually act and meaningfully be part of the universe or be the universe. And I think that perhaps part of what is suggested in Nat's book is not to reject neuroscience, right? Okay, but to look at other modes of engagement and conversation which aren't as conducive to that peril of forfeiting our agency. I'm gonna have to leave it at that because I actually have to go. I'm so sorry, and I know that we haven't resolved anything, so I apologize. I apologize. And there's all these comments on the messages we didn't get to, because we didn't really talk about the relationship with capitalism, strictly speaking, right? So I'm gonna just pause. I'm gonna stop the recording, and then I'm gonna jump off. You guys can still talk if you want. I actually have to.
Excellent.
So
I appreciate you letting us in the room. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you, Nat.
Great discussion. Great discussion.
Right
Thank
on.
you.
Right now.
Thank you.